Senator Ted Cruz just annihilated Congresswoman Maxine Waters' 3-4-year political reign on live television using her own public records. Your family pocketed over $1 million from your political ties, all while you lecture everyday Americans about corruption. Those precise words struck Congresswoman Maxine Waters like a physical punch. Her face drained of all color as Senator Ted Cruz relentlessly continued reading straight from official documents. Your husband held $350,000 in one United Bank stock. You organized the Treasury meeting, and that bank secured $12 million in taxpayer bailouts. Waters sat frozen, entirely speechless. The politician who dictated Washington banking policies for 34 years was being methodically wrecked on live TV by a guy she brushed off as a rookie senator from Texas. But how did we end up here? Picture this scene. 45 minutes prior, the most dominant woman in American banking struts into a Senate hearing room, fully intending to embarrass another Republican on national broadcast. She has never lost a financial debate. She has intimidated Treasury secretaries before, and this is meant to be her victory lap. What she fails to realize is that the quiet guy sitting in the corner spent 3 weeks assembling a political explosive, and he is ready to trigger it. This is the narrative of how raw constitutional expertise wiped out 34 years of hoarded power in under an hour. It is the story of how a Harvard Law alum with a pocket constitution tore down a political empire. It shows how one meticulously prepared senator reminded Washington that in America, absolutely nobody is above the law. The Senate Banking Committee is live across every network. Waters demanded this hearing to crush Republican banking opposition. She spots Cruz's name and chuckles, thinking he is just a senator while she is the supreme expert. But Cruz has been getting ready for 3 solid weeks. Ethics reports, financial statements, constitutional breaches, they are all documented and ready to go. Waters adjusts her microphone with absolute confidence. Cruz opens his folder for the final time. The ambush is ready to commence. Waters leaned forward in her seat, fixing Cruz with that withering glare that made Fortune 500 CEOs trip over their own words. Her tone carried the sheer authority of someone who never lost a policy fight, someone wielding influence since before Cruz even entered the political arena. Senator Cruz, I am genuinely curious. What exactly qualifies a junior senator from Texas to lecture this committee regarding financial regulation? Did Harvard Law School actually teach banking law? Or were you too preoccupied with abstract constitutional theories to grasp real-world economics? The room shifted uncomfortably. Waters just publicly mocked a Harvard Law graduate's credentials on national TV. It was an aggressive opening strike, calculated to throw Cruz on the defensive and assert her dominance right out of the gate. Several Democratic committee members nodded in approval. This was the Maxine Waters they recognized, the fierce partisan who never retreated from a brawl, who could dismantle Republicans with surgical accuracy. But Cruz's grin never faded. If anything, it grew slightly warmer as he reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn booklet. It was the pocket Constitution that served as his signature prop throughout his Senate tenure. Congresswoman Waters, that is a fascinating question, he stated, his Texas drawl making every single word deliberate and measured. But may I ask you something in return? What exact constitutional authority grants Congress the unlimited power to regulate American banking? The question lingered in the air like a pulled pin on a grenade. Waters' confident look flickered, just for a split second, but every single camera in the room captured that brief flash of doubt. This was definitely not the reply she anticipated. Republicans normally got defensive when she attacked their background, scrambling to explain their qualifications and getting flustered. Cruz was flipping the script with calm certainty. Waters sat up straight, obviously annoyed by the sudden pushback. Her voice adopted that sharp, prosecutorial tone that made her legendary in Democratic circles. Senator, do not lecture me on constitutional authority. I have been defending this Constitution and American families for 34 years, while you have been playing petty political games down in Texas. Mom, with all due respect, Cruz answered, opening his Constitution to a specific page with practiced ease. I am not playing games. I am reading Article 1, Section 8, which outlines the 18 specific powers given to Congress by the Constitution. Banking regulation is not explicitly stated among those powers. So, under what exact constitutional theory do you justify the CFPB's existence? The room fell completely silent. This was not the easy questioning Waters planned for. Cruz was demanding answers to core questions about constitutional boundaries that struck at the very foundation of federal overreach, questions she never genuinely considered during her 3 decades of ballooning government rules. Waters sensed her first real surge of panic. She spent her whole career assuming her authority, never questioning it, and never needing to defend it against someone who thoroughly grasped constitutional law at a Supreme Court tier. Her tone became highly defensive. The Commerce Clause clearly grants us the authority to regulate financial entities. That is basic constitutional law. Senator Cruz nodded patiently, resembling a constitutional law professor dealing with a highly unprepared student. The Commerce Clause permits Congress to regulate interstate commerce, correct. But does that involve spawning an unaccountable bureaucracy with limitless power to draft rules carrying the weight of law without distinct congressional approval? Because that sounds less like managing commerce and heavily like legislative surrender. He flipped to a different page in his booklet seamlessly. You see, Mom, James Madison stated in Federalist 45 that the powers handed to the federal government are few and defined. Where exactly did the Constitution outline Congress' ability to spawn agencies that enforce binding regulations without direct legislative permission? Waters realized she was sinking in far deeper waters than she anticipated. The Texas constitutional scholar was not retreating, and even worse, he was highlighting her core ignorance of the very document she swore to protect 18 times throughout her tenure. Every single senator present started realizing they were watching a historic event, a sitting committee chair receiving a basic constitutional law tutorial on national broadcast. Senator Cruz, the Constitution is a living document, Waters stated, falling back on the typical progressive talking point that worked for her for decades. The founders could not have predicted modern banking networks. We must adapt constitutional concepts to current problems. It was the absolute worst thing she could say. Cruz's grin widened as he smelled blood in the water. Congresswoman, that is an intriguing interpretation, but if the Constitution simply means whatever Congress wants it to mean at any given second, then it actually does not restrict government power whatsoever. Does it? You are basically arguing that the text you swore to defend is utterly meaningless the moment it gets inconvenient. He leaned forward a bit, his tone projecting the command of a man who debated constitutional battles at the Supreme Court and secured victories. The founders actually predicted this precise issue. That is exactly why they drafted the 10th Amendment, which clearly dictates that powers not handed to the United States by the Constitution are kept by the states and the citizens, respectively. They understood politicians would constantly crave more authority than the Constitution allows them. Waters was now clearly rattled. 34 years of political maneuvering meant absolute zero when confronting legitimate constitutional comprehension and legal mastery. She strutted into this room, planning to argue banking policy and rule effectiveness. Instead, she was receiving an advanced seminar in constitutional law from a guy who studied and executed it at the peak of American jurisprudence. I do not need a lecture from you regarding constitutional concepts, she snapped, her confidence fracturing for the first time in decades. "I have been battling for working families and protecting democracy since before you even entered politics." "Mom," Cruz responded with brutal composure, "fighting for working folks is truly commendable, but the Constitution does not hand Congress the power to just do whatever it deems nice for working families. It grants specific, enumerated powers, and nowhere in those 18 strictly defined powers do I spot unrestricted banking regulation or the creation of rogue bureaucracies drafting binding laws." He paused, allowing his statement to resonate before dropping the fatal strike. "The absolute brilliance of our constitutional framework is that it chokes government overreach even when that government possesses good intentions, especially when it has good intentions, because the founders knew the path to tyranny is paved by politicians who think their good intentions excuse shattering constitutional boundaries." Round one concluded, and everybody in the room recognized the victor. Waters marched into a constitutional shredder, and her standard maneuvers of personal insults and fake outrage proved completely useless against authentic legal understanding and constitutional mastery. The banking committee boss who bullied Washington for decades was getting clinically schooled by a senator she tried to write off as incompetent. But this was merely the warm-up. Cruz had significantly more destructive ammo waiting inside his manila folder. Sensing fatal danger, Waters resorted to what she always did. When trapped, she launched a full-scale assault. Her voice spiked with intense outrage, bouncing off the committee walls with the momentum of 3 decades of hoarded political fury. "Do not you dare preach to me about constitutional authority, Senator. At least I have never sold out working households to Wall Street donors the way your party does every single day. I spent my whole life fighting for the little guy, while Republicans like yourself carry water for massive banks and corporate elites." It was a strategic pivot, crafted to drag the argument away from constitutional law, where she was obviously and humiliatingly crushed, back to political mudslinging and partisan jabs, where she felt secure and arrogant. The Democratic committee members nodded in agreement. This was their hero, their brawler, fighting off Republican hypocrisy, utilizing the moral high ground of a person dedicating her life to economic fairness. But it was the absolute worst possible maneuver. Cruz's eyes illuminated with a predatory thrill as his hand reached intentionally for the manila folder he held all morning. In that one instance, Waters stepped straight into the snare he spent 3 weeks meticulously baiting. She handed him the flawless opportunity to obliterate her reputation forever. Cruz flipped open the folder with calculated, dramatic exactness, the noise of shifting papers echoing loudly in the dead-silent room. When he glanced up, his face underwent a slight but undeniable shift, morphing from polite scholar to hardened courtroom interrogator. This was a guy who battled 9 cases in front of the United States Supreme Court, and he was ready to show exactly why he maintained an undefeated record. "Congresswoman, since you brought up battling for working families and dodging conflicts with financial mega-institutions, I would love to chat about One United Bank with you." The impact was immediate and total. Waters' face went dead pale, her arrogant stance collapsing, as though she caught a sledgehammer to the chest. Her hands dug into the table's edge as she realized what was dropping next. Every journalist in that room who understood D.C. politics knew precisely what Cruz just pulled. He just dropped a political atomic bomb. The title One United hovered in the room like an execution order. Committee members squirmed awkwardly in their chairs, abruptly recalling why they recognized that name. Democratic aides feverishly started whispering among themselves, their expressions projecting poorly hidden terror. Waters' own aides looked desperate to hide under the desks. Cruz extracted a basic calculator and started reciting from his files with clinical precision, his tone projecting the systematic dominance of a prosecutor dropping bulletproof evidence on a jury. For anyone watching at home who might not know about One United Bank, let me drop some vital context. Back in September 2008, right in the middle of the financial meltdown, Congresswoman Waters personally set up a meeting between Treasury Department executives and delegates from this minority-owned bank. He paused for dramatic impact, letting the gravity of the facts hit while Waters sat paralyzed in panic. What she deliberately hid back then, and what later investigations exposed, was that her husband, Sidney Williams, held $350,000 worth of stock in that exact bank and sat on its board of directors from 2004 until 2008. Waters attempted to cut in, her voice breaking with sheer desperation. "That is ancient history. I was completely cleared by the House Ethics Committee following a thorough probe." "Mom, please let me finish." Cruz pressed on with brutal calmness, his finger dragging methodically down the paper as he read official records. "Following the meeting you personally orchestrated, a meeting where Treasury executives were stunned to find that One United was the only minority bank present, One United Bank bagged $12 million in taxpayer bailout cash from the Troubled Asset Relief Program." He glared up from his files, his eyes locking onto Waters' terrified stare. "Your family's investment survived. Your husband's shares did not go completely worthless. The exact bank your family held a massive financial stake in bagged a taxpayer-funded bailout right after a meeting you personally put together." The room was deathly quiet, broken only by the noise of journalists frantically writing notes and cameras snapping. Waters appeared to be struggling for air, but Cruz was far from done. He yanked another file from his folder. "But the plot gets way more fascinating. Based on the House Ethics Committee's own probe, your chief of staff back then, who just so happens to be your grandson, Mikhail Moore, was caught actively helping One United Bank lock down federal bailout money." Waters' voice spiked to almost a scream. "My grandson was just doing his job. There was absolutely nothing inappropriate regarding." "Mom," Cruz cut her off with lethal precision. "Your grandson fired off emails explicitly stating One United was tanking. He handed the bank draft legislation. He kept in touch with bank bosses on your behalf, all while your family had hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line." He grabbed his calculator and started punching digits. "Let me break this down for the American citizens watching. $350,000 made up between 4.6 and 15.2% of your family's entire net worth. If One United collapsed, exactly as the Ethics Committee stated, your husband's portfolio would have been completely wiped out." The calculated math of the corruption was catastrophic. Waters scrambled wildly to protect herself. "I truly believed I was assisting all minority banks. I had no idea the meeting was going to center around One United." Cruz's comeback was rapid and ruthless. "Mom, you personally set up a meeting between Treasury executives and banks, and you did not know which specific bank would be the topic? Either you are flat-out lying about your awareness of the meeting's agenda, or you are confessing to massive negligence in managing conflicts of interest. So, which one is it?" The question hung in the room like a guillotine blade over Waters' head. There was zero good response, and every person sitting there knew it. But Cruz kept pushing. He whipped out another document. Based on Los Angeles Times reports from 2004, your family members banked over $1 million during your time in Congress by running operations with businesses and politicians you assisted. Your daughter, Karen Waters, and your son, Edward Waters, continuously cashed in on your political leverage and influence. His tone shifted into pure moral authority. "This is not about defending working families, Congresswoman. This is about systematically making your own family rich by exploiting your political seat. You orchestrated bailouts for banks where your family held cash interests. You hired your own grandson to run your staff, and he assisted in securing federal dollars for corporations that paid your family directly. Waters was visibly vibrating now, a mix of sheer anger and total panic. You have zero right to attack my family. They did nothing wrong. I am not attacking your family, ma'am. Cruz fired back with icy composure. I am reading directly from public records, ethics committee files, and journalistic investigations. The real question is, why do you believe your relatives should cash in on your public office while you sit up here lecturing everyone else about corruption and corporate greed? He leaned back in his seat, his voice adopting a conversational vibe that somehow made the impact even worse. You marched into this hearing accusing me of being bought by corporate money. But the hard evidence proves that you personally set up federal bailouts for companies where your family held massive financial stakes. You made your relatives wealthy using your political ties. You morphed public service into a personal family enterprise. The devastation was absolute. Waters sat completely paralyzed, failing to put together understandable sentences. The politician who screamed corruption at Cruz was just surgically revealed as the exact definition of everything Americans despise about Washington politics: leveraging public office for private cash, enriching relatives, and exploiting power for personal financial gain. But Cruz saved his most lethal weapon for the grand finale. Backed into a corner with her reputation shredded, Waters launched one final, frantic effort to flip the script. Her voice fractured with poorly hidden terror as she grabbed the absolute last weapon available to her. How dare you question my ethics when your party backed the January 6th insurrection? You want to discuss constitutional breaches? Let's discuss Republicans attempting to crush democracy and sparking violence against the U.S. government. It was her final play, thrown with the sheer panic of a person whose political life hung by a thread. She prayed to drag the focus away from her undeniable corruption over to partisan shouting regarding January 6th, where she assumed she held the moral high ground. But it was exactly what Cruz anticipated. His calm smirk reappeared as he pulled yet another file from his seemingly infinite folder. He prepped for this exact moment, this specific pivot, and he was geared up to deliver the kill shot. Cruz leaned back, his attitude morphing once more, transitioning from lead prosecutor to constitutional scholar, delivering a lesson that people would cite for decades. When he spoke, his tone held the gravity of a man who didn't just read constitutional law, but actively defended it at the highest court. Congresswoman, let us evaluate your claim regarding inciting violence and constitutional violations on January 6th. I address the constitutional method for contesting electoral votes, a method utilized by Democrats in 2001, 2005, and 2017. I advocated for peaceful legal protests squarely within constitutional limits. He raised a piece of paper from his file with dramatic flair. But let's examine your personal history with incitement. On the 17th of April 2021, you stood in front of protesters in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a town suffering through violent riots for consecutive days. And you stated, and I am quoting your exact language here, "We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." The quote slammed the room like a concrete block. Waters attempted to interject, but Cruz bulldozed forward mercilessly. This was not some peaceful gathering, Congresswoman. This occurred during active riots. Buildings were on fire, businesses were getting robbed, cops were taking hits, and you instructed protesters to get more confrontational. He whipped out another sheet, but that was not a one-off event. On the 25th of June 2018, you instructed a mob of your fans at an LA rally. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out, and you create a crowd. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. Waters scrambled wildly to protect herself. I was discussing peaceful protesting. I never advocated for violence. Cruz' retaliation was instant and brutal. Mom, what exactly did you assume would occur when you ordered folks to get more confrontational during riots that were already violent? What did you think pushback meant when you deliberately targeted specific government workers? Either you are insanely oblivious to the weight and fallout of your own words, or you knew perfectly well what you were inciting. He pulled out another piece of paper. Following your 2018 statements, numerous Republican staff were systematically harassed inside restaurants and open spaces. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was cornered and chased out of a Mexican restaurant by activists screaming your precise words. White House aide Stephen Miller was ambushed while eating. I, myself, was cornered and threatened by a mob while dining out with my wife. His voice adopted absolute moral clarity. Your statements directly caused harassment, threats, and physical confrontation. You birthed an environment where political rivals could not show up in public without getting swarmed. That is not peaceful protesting, Congresswoman. That is coordinated political terrorism. Waters was physically shaking at this point. I never ordered anybody to act violently. I back peaceful protests. Then why? Cruz demanded with clinical accuracy. Did you instruct rioters to get more confrontational during ongoing riots? Why did you order people to form mobs to push back on targeted individuals? Why didn't you demand peace and civil conversation instead of ramping up escalation and conflict? He leaned in to deliver the finishing blow. You see, Congresswoman, there is a core difference between us. When I spoke on January 6th, I advocated for constitutional procedures and peaceful assembly inside legal boundaries. When you open your mouth, you demand clashes in the streets, the harassment of public officials, and getting more confrontational while U.S. cities burn. His volume dropped to a near whisper, yet it echoed into every corner of the room. One of us actually comprehends and honors the Constitution. The other believes securing political power excuses absolutely any tactic necessary. Waters sat trapped in paralyzed silence, but Cruz was not done. He was preparing to unleash absolute destruction. Congresswoman Waters, let's recap the reality. You have held office for 34 years. Over that span, you landed on the most corrupt politicians list by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington 4 separate times, in 2005, 2006, 2009, and 2011. He started counting off points on his hand. You orchestrated federal bailouts for banks where your own family held massive financial stakes. You methodically made your relatives wealthy through your political leverage, with your family cashing in over $1 million from deals linked to your power. You repeatedly demanded the confrontation and harassment of your political rivals. His voice carried the absolute finality of a judge dropping a sentence. You are no champion of the working class, Mom. You are no protector of democracy. You represent exactly what the Founding Fathers dreaded when they built our constitutional framework. A career politician who forgot that in America, nobody is above the law, and absolutely nobody is entitled to power. He slammed his folder shut with a sharp crack. You wasted 34 years hoarding power, leverage, and cash through your office. But you forgot that political authority in America is meant to be temporary, transparent, and bound by constitutional borders. You morphed into the exact monster our Constitution was built to stop. Waters sat in utter, catastrophic silence, her jaw hanging slightly open, incapable of putting words together. 34 years of stacked power and influence was just clinically obliterated on national broadcast television. The politician who strutted into the hearing room acting like the monarch of banking rules was crawling out as a blatant warning about the toxic rot of unchecked power and the absolute necessity of constitutional boundaries on government. Reach. The constitutional expert from Texas just warned everybody watching that in this country, facts and foundations still outweigh rank and authority. The dead silence that trailed Cruz's final statement was unlike anything the veteran journalists in the room ever witnessed. It dragged on for what seemed like an eternity, thick and choking, as if the oxygen got sucked right out of the building. Committee politicians from both sides sat locked in their seats, clueless on how to proceed, refusing to be the first person to shatter the tension Cruz just established. Waters stayed entirely still, staring blankly at the desk as if begging to vanish. Her hands, which were moving arrogantly just an hour prior, rested flat and lifeless on the desk. The woman who bullied Washington's banking sector for over 3 decades looked thoroughly crushed, dismantled in a manner nobody in that room ever witnessed before. Senator Chuck Grassley, the committee head, cleared his throat awkwardly, the noise deafening in the quiet. "We will take a 1-5-minute recess," he declared, his tone shaky. The standard routines of thanking guests and organizing follow-up questions felt ridiculously out of place after the slaughter everyone just watched. The second the cameras cut, the room exploded into barely contained madness. Journalists sprinted for the doors, phones already smashed against their ears, realizing they just watched the political event of the decade. Democratic aides clustered around Waters, their expressions projecting pure panic and defeat. They just witnessed their hero get clinically destroyed on national TV, and they realized the wreckage was permanent. Out in the corridor, Waters' PR rep was already dodging a flood of calls from journalists nationwide. "No comment at this time," she echoed repeatedly, but her tone leaked the terror everyone heard loud and clear. Her media director scrambled on his phone, trying to set up damage control spots. But what possible excuse could they push against hard evidence and official ethics files? Waters' chief of staff, the exact grandson mentioned over and over during Cruz's lethal breakdown, leaned against the wall, his face completely pale, as he grasped that his own part in the One United disaster was back on the front page. The family enterprise that funded the Waters clan for decades was officially blown open for the whole country to examine. Simultaneously, across the nation, social media detonated with unmatched rage. Within minutes of the hearing wrapping up, the tag "Waters Destroyed" blew up on Twitter, rapidly hitting the #1 spot in America. The tag "Constitutional Scholar" trailed right behind, as conservative users hyped Cruz's execution. One United started trending as citizens hunted for more details on the banking corruption. Conservative Twitter went wild. Clips of Cruz's most lethal drops were forwarded thousands of times a minute. The video of Waters sitting paralyzed in shock after Cruz's closing shot was instantly converted into memes. That split second when she realized he was bringing up One United Bank, the absolute dread that flashed across her face, became an immediate viral hit. Left-wing pages scrambled wildly to drop context or pivot to different topics, but the wreckage was too obvious, too documented, and too devastating to spin away. Some attempted to smear Cruz's past, takes or drag up January 6th again, but it rang hollow after Waters' own history of incitement got so ruthlessly laid bare. Media outlets across the board were forced to broadcast the disaster. CNN aired the footage, but attempted to downplay the damage. Fox News ran the event as their headline for the whole night. MSNBC scrambled wildly to cover alternative topics, but their own audience demanded coverage of what everyone labeled the political slaughter of the decade. The most brutal videos circulated faster than the channels could monitor them: the constitutional authority showdown, the One United nuke detonating, the family corruption drops, the confrontational incitement trap, and finally, the absolute silence as Waters grasped her career was basically finished. Political commentators from all sides strained to recall similar events in U.S. political lore. Some pointed back to legendary Senate clashes from the 1800s. Others compared it to the most brutal Supreme Court oral arguments. But everybody agreed they never witnessed such a clinical, evidence-backed, and total political assassination pulled off with such cold accuracy. Republican senators watching the broadcast were already ringing Cruz's team, eager to piggyback on his execution. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, never one to pass up a political opening, dropped a statement within the hour. Senator Cruz proved today exactly what principled constitutional leadership looks like. He proved that prep work and mastery of our founding texts can defeat decades of hoarded power. Democratic leadership went into total panic mode. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's team dropped a highly filtered statement backing Waters while dodging any talk of her actual debate performance. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's crew quietly warned Democrats to stay completely silent on the hearing. The fallout was instantly obvious to D.C. insiders. Waters' power as a committee boss was completely shattered. How could she grill witnesses on ethics when her own massive violations were brutally exposed? How could she preach about constitutional issues when she displayed total ignorance of basic constitutional law? But past the instant political fallout, something much bigger occurred. Cruz proved that constitutional mastery acts as a lethal political weapon. Grasping the founding papers, doing the homework, and holding the line on principles demolished political tenure, deep state power, and partisan noise. A fresh blueprint was locked in for attacking the Washington machine. Show up prepared, master the Constitution, bring the receipts, and never fold on constitutional facts. The renegade from Texas just proved to every constitutional conservative nationwide exactly what happens when somebody actually comprehends and voices the core rules of American governance. The session concluded, but the political shockwave it launched was just kicking off. In the days after the clash, the political terrain shifted in ways barely anyone predicted. Ted Cruz did not just win an argument, he completely changed the path of U.S. political debate and his personal brand in exactly 45 minutes. Cruz Senate headquarters got swamped with interview demands from every massive news channel, conservative podcast, and political group in America. His crew, completely blindsided by the massive national spotlight, grinded non-stop to handle the flood. Speaking offers rained in from colleges, think tanks, and political outfits everywhere. Conservative backers who totally ignored the junior senator from Texas suddenly rushed to bankroll his next moves. More crucially, Cruz proved something constitutional. Conservatives prayed for but rarely saw. Executed flawlessly. Deep mastery of founding rules works as an incredible political weapon. His debate footage became mandatory viewing inside Republican strategy rooms everywhere. Campaign managers started telling their guys to read constitutional law, not just cheap talking points. The Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and Federalist Society all sent requests for keynote speeches. Constitutional law teachers started rolling the hearing clips into their classes, leveraging Cruz's clinical breakdown of Waters' excuses as the perfect case study on how constitutional rules must drive policy fights. Rookie Republican politicians nationwide paid close attention. The stale playbook for political victory, raising cash, shaking hands, and spinning the media, got challenged by a fresh strategy built on intellectual groundwork, constitutional gansery, and principled logic. Cruz proved there was a real counter to the empty, soundbite-driven garbage that controlled D.C. for decades. For Waters, the fallout was catastrophic and instant. Democratic peers who once begged for her backing and tips started running away from her toxic comments and confirmed ethical rot. Committee hearings that used to be her personal stage turned into desperate damage control sessions. Finance bosses who used to dread sitting in front of her committee now viewed her as a bleeding target, who completely lost the authority to threaten them. How could a politician outed for orchestrating bailouts to pad her family's bank accounts lecture anybody else on corporate duty? The Democratic Party confronted a massive credibility disaster. Waters stood as one of their loudest voices, demanding financial rules, and her public execution forced ugly questions about other entrenched members who hoarded power while dodging accountability. If a politician with Waters' tenure and insider access could get ripped apart so completely, what did that reveal about the rest of the party bosses? Progressive groups that blindly backed Waters hit a brick wall. They physically could not defend her exposed ethical garbage, but admitting Cruz won meant confessing their hero was fundamentally dirty. A ton of them just quietly scrubbed her name from their campaigns and PR materials. The showdown triggered a massive national debate regarding term limits, constitutional boundaries, and the toxic nature of career politicians in the U.S. system. Cruz's point that 34 years is way too long for anybody to hold office clicked across the political spectrum, with citizens sick of Washington's permanent ruling class. Constitutional conservative groups reported massive spikes in sign-ups and cash flow. The Federalist Society locked in its biggest jump in fresh recruits in 10 years. Pocket constitutions flew off the shelves as citizens scrambled to learn the foundational rules Cruz weaponized so flawlessly. Law universities everywhere saw a wave of questions about constitutional law tracks from young adults fired up by Cruz's execution. The concept that constitutional mastery offered a real route to political power drew in a fresh wave of future leaders who demanded hard facts over cheap flash. The media machine was forced to pivot as well. Journalists who coasted on lazy political takes realized they had to actually learn constitutional law to properly report on the new political battlefield Cruz unlocked. Fact-checkers grinded overtime trying to debunk the files and legal history Cruz brought up, only to realize his prep work was flawless and his receipts were bulletproof. Global watchers pointed out the massive weight of what just happened. In a timeline where democratic systems take hits globally, America watched proof of how constitutional facts and principled logic build an absolute fortress against corruption and power abuse. The clash also exposed the broken education system that built someone like Waters, a politician surviving 34 years, without ever actually studying the constitutional bedrock of the U.S. government. Universities everywhere started auditing their civics programs, admitting that building smart voters takes way more than basic policy reviews. Think tanks and research hubs started rolling out fresh modules targeting constitutional fluency for government workers. The concept that politicians need to actually comprehend the paper they swear to protect gained real momentum as something bigger than a basic conservative soundbite. For the constitutional conservative push, Cruz's execution dropped the ultimate playbook for future political fights. Instead of just fighting liberal rules using basic ideology, they could rip them apart using constitutional boundaries with hard legal facts and ironclad paperwork. The shift in Cruz's personal political ranking was insane. In one night, he flipped from being branded a divisive guy, known mostly for fighting Republican bosses, to being respected as a heavy-hitting constitutional scholar and a legit presidential threat. Political pundits who previously mocked him as a loudmouth outsider had to swallow their pride and recognize his raw intelligence and tactical brilliance. The showdown achieved what decades of conservative grinding failed to do. It made constitutional conservatism look incredibly sharp to average voters. By proving that constitutional facts crush political tenure, Cruz fired up a new wave of citizens to treat the founding papers with real respect. But perhaps the biggest takeaway was that the hearing reminded the American public that their government runs on a physical document carrying strict, capped powers. And the second politicians ignore that core reality. They expose themselves to the people who remember it. What citizens watched inside that Senate Banking Committee room on that brutal afternoon was not a basic political spat. It was a masterclass, proving how print, and constitutional facts absolutely crush stacked power and deep state authority. Ted Cruz did not win because he yelled louder, acted more aggressive, or had deeper D.C. connections than Maxine Waters. He won because he grasped a core truth that she completely abandoned in the United States. Political authority has to be anchored in constitutional facts. The difference was night and day. On one side sat a politician who flexed power for 34 years, stacking leverage and rank through seniority and backroom deals, convinced that just being there a long time was enough to lead. On the opposite side sat a man who knew that every drop of political power in America bleeds from a written constitution packed with specific, capped, and listed authorities, and who spent his whole life dissecting, practicing, and shielding those exact rules. Waters' absolute destruction acted as a brutal siren for every career politician convinced that surviving a long time equals legitimacy, that seniority beats accountability, or that having nice goals gives them a pass to shatter constitutional borders. Her total takedown proved that in this country, nobody, regardless of their rank, their years in office, or their D.C. contacts, is above the Constitution or safe from constitutional payback. The showdown exposed a deep truth regarding the core of political authority inside a constitutional republic. Waters hoarded massive power and control over her decades inside D.C., but that power rested on shaky political dirt rather than concrete constitutional foundations. When attacked by somebody who grasped the true origin of government power, the Constitution itself, her entire fortress of hoarded authority collapsed in minutes. Cruz's clinical strategy dropped a perfect blueprint for how constitutional conservatives need to handle political warfare. He arrived, stacked with receipts, legal history, and hard constitutional logic. He refused to lean on cheap talking points or partisan noise. Instead, he locked every single point into the founding rules of the U.S. government, making it literally impossible for Waters to brush off his attacks as basic political grandstanding. The clash also exposed the absolute necessity for constitutional literacy inside American political ranks. Waters' glaring ignorance of constitutional law, her total failure to explain the constitutional foundation for rules she pushed for decades, laid bare the educational and mental rot infecting a massive chunk of America's ruling class. For American citizens, the clash delivered a massive lesson on what to hunt for when picking leaders. The next time a politician demands infinite power to fix complicated issues, voters need to ask them the exact same question Cruz threw at Waters. What exact constitutional authority grants you that power? The reply will expose absolutely everything voters need to figure out if that politician earns their trust and backing. The hearing proved that constitutional mastery is not some boring academic joke. It is a lethal political weapon capable of outing corruption, fighting power abuse, and forcing government elites to answer to the citizens they work for. Cruz proved that politicians who genuinely grasp the Constitution hold a massive advantage over the ones who just pretend they have authority. Most importantly, the showdown reminded every single citizen that our system operates on a written document that strictly means what it says. Politicians do not get to inflate federal reach just because they pitch noble ideas or carry good intentions. The Constitution lays out specific, capped powers for specific, capped reasons. When politicians smash through those limits, exactly like Waters did non-stop over her entire career, they break their oath of office and stab the American public in the back. Cruz's execution brought hope to constitutional conservatives tired of political bosses promising to protect the Constitution while showing zero proof they even read the thing. Here stood a politician, reciting constitutional text from memory, grasping legal history and constitutional timelines, and dropping heavy legal logic using straightforward language. The clash also dropped massive proof of how personal prep work and hardcore principles completely crush institutional leverage and political hype. Cruz did not require a massive crew, overpriced advisors, or media spin to secure the win. He only needed a lethal grasp of constitutional law, obsessive preparation, and the guts to attack power using facts. For the constitutional conservative push, the showdown marked a massive pivot. It proved that mental toughness and constitutional mastery hit harder than any other political tool. It proved that citizens are starving for leaders who actually get and can voice the founding rules of their country. The massive lesson goes way past partisan fighting and hits the core question of how citizens want to be ruled. Do they want bosses, stacking power through tenure and backroom deals, or leaders pulling their authority straight from constitutional facts? Do they want politicians assuming infinite power to fix things, or politicians respecting the constitutional caps on government reach? Cruz's clinical demolition of Waters dropped a crystal-clear answer. Americans fired back with massive support for principled leadership anchored in constitutional facts. They cheered the win of prep work over arrogance, hard facts over cheap style, and constitutional rules over raw political leverage. The showdown goes down as a legendary marker in U.S. political history. It was the day constitutional facts proved way stronger than political tenure, when doing the homework destroyed rank, and when the founding rules of the U.S. government reminded the D.C. machine that inside this republic, absolutely nobody outranks the Constitution. Ted Cruz strutted into that room as a junior senator from Texas, holding absolutely nothing except a manila folder and a pocket constitution. He marched out as a massive national powerhouse who proved the unbreakable force of America's founding rules. Maxine Waters strutted in as one of the most dominant politicians in Washington. She crawled out as a brutal warning about what occurs when politicians forget their power flows from the citizens, is choked by the Constitution, and always faces accountability. The constitutional expert from Texas just reminded everybody watching that in America, the Constitution actually matters. Facts crush power, and the founding rules of limited government act as the ultimate shield against political dirt and power abuse. At the end of the day, the hearing was never truly about banking rules or financial laws. It attacked the core issue defining American politics since 1787. Will we be run by constitutional facts, or by the chaotic demands of whoever happens to sit in power? Ted Cruz dropped a massive answer, and America walked away better for it.